All right, that should have everything in place. Just double checking to make sure it's working. Oops. Okay. I should have. I'll just give another minute for people to log in, either by Zoom or by YouTube Live. Just give it a moment. After all, it's only 12 o'clock. We haven't even let the minute go by. Don't want to leave anyone out that wants to be here from the beginning. It's hard to get people to coordinate schedules, so give a little bit of a cushion, but not much, because we've got a bit to talk about. Well, we always do every week, but this week there's a lot of backstory that needs to go in to help you understand it, and I'm going to have to summarize that. So I want to make sure we've got time to not only get through that, but to see how it applies to the actual text that we're dealing with. And what text is that? Well, we are in Numbers 36. We are here at the end of the book of Bamidbar. And you might think that as we come to the conclusion of the book of Numbers, that all the drama and all the story that we've been dealing with is finally over. After all, the main generation that was so problematic has passed away. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam have all been handled, with Miriam and Aaron passing away, and Moses being told to pass on leadership, that he will not be crossing into the land. But it is precisely that crossing into the land that is going to be our topic today. And although the book of Deuteronomy will cover with much of this in some summary form, here we get much more of the narrative. See, we were just told earlier in this section of Torah that once the Israelites cross over the Jordan and come into the land of Israel, that the land will be apportioned, that it will be divided up according to the different tribes, and then within each tribe there will be the different clans, and within each clan there'll be different families based upon the head of each of those households. So therefore, each household is going to be allocated a certain amount of land. As I have mentioned numerous times, land was absolutely essential because this was the means of sustaining oneself for 90 to 99%, depending upon the time and place, of humans throughout our history. It's only been very recently that most of us are not growing our own food or involved in the food production in some way. And that's really only changed in the last 100, 150 years. So getting land wasn't just a question of, yay, I've got a little place to put up a white picket fence. This was good. Now I can survive because the manna is not going to be there in the land of Israel. We're going to have to farm and shepherd and run orchards and vineyards and all that other sort of thing. And to do all of that, you need land. Now, with that apportionment of land and the promise that it's going to be fair and going to be equitable, we are going to come up with a question. And this question is going to be based upon a little bit of history. But we're going to get the question first, and then we're going to fill in the history, because the history might not make sense entirely if you don't understand what the question is. Sometimes that's the way it works. So let's dive into chapter 36 with everything I've just said in mind and preparing ourselves to hit the brakes and do a little review to understand the issue. Chapter 36, verse 1. There came near the heads of the fathers' houses of a clan, son of Gilad, son of Machir, son of Menashe, and son of the clans of Joseph. All right, so little family pedigree. We're basically under Joseph's section, and through Menashe, through one of his sons, and we're drilling down into one of the smaller clans. They spoke before Moshe and before the leaders, the heads of the fathers' houses of the children of Israel. So this is a public issue and a very formal complaint. Well, let's call it a complaint, because it really is at this point. They said, "It is my Lord that Adonai has commanded to give out the land as inheritance by lot." It's going to be randomly assigned to the children of Israel. And my Lord was commanded by Adonai to give out the inheritance of Zelophehad, our brother, to his daughters. All right, so they're laying out the basic context here, which is Moses, God told you that you need to divide up the land by lot among all of the Israelites. And that needs to be understood also with the fact that God told you to give an inheritance to Slofachad's daughters, because he died, previous chapters, he died, leaving no male heirs, and it was a complaint by the daughters of Slofachad that their father would be erased from all of Israel just because he didn't have any boys. But he did have girls, so why should that disappear? Rather than being, it would be absorbed back into his brothers or uncles or other male relatives, and his line would be gone, and his allotment, his inheritance, would have been essentially, in their eyes, of his daughters, would have been stolen. God agreed, said in the case where you have daughters but no sons, that the daughters should inherit from their father. Now, why does that matter? Well, we have to keep in mind that the daughters do not maintain the same obligatory tribal affiliation. Yes, in Judaism, the religious status of whether a person is Jewish or not Jewish is transmitted matrilineally through the mother, but the tribal status is translated patrilineally. So if your father was a member of the tribe of Menashe, then you will be a member of the tribe of Menashe. It doesn't matter where your mother's from, it matters where your father's from. And that was because inheritance in the economic system of the day was transmitted father to son, father to son. It was a patrilineal inheritance system. So that's why the daughters of Slofachad, when they raised their question about whether daughters could inherit under some circumstances, that was changing from the accepted norm of the ancient Near East. That was carving out a special protection for women and for the girl's father, that if he happened to not have any sons, that nonetheless his inheritance would still be transmitted through his line rather than through one of his brothers, uncles, or someone else. So they made that carve out for the daughters of Slofachad, that they would inherit their father's land. But you can begin to see the shadow of the question that Menashe, the rest of the tribe, is having. If his daughters inherit his land, which is part of our land of this tribe, well, what happens next? And that's where we're moving into verse 3. Now, should they, the daughters, be for one of the members of another tribe of the tribe of the children of Israel as wives, that is to say, if they get married to someone from Judah, if they get married from someone from Benjamin, their inheritance will be diminished from the inheritance of their fathers and be added to the inheritance of the tribe for whom they become, meaning wives. From our allotted inheritance, it will be diminished. That is the problem here, that the leaders of the tribe of Menashe, in this case, are saying, wait. Let me get this straight. We're going to divide up the land by lottery, by tribe, because clearly it seems important that the tribes have allotments, that it's not just each individual Israelite wherever they are, but our tribal affiliation still seems to be important. Well, if our tribal affiliation is important, and if the portion that goes to each tribe is important, then if you allow women from the tribe under those special circumstances to inherit, and then they move to marry somebody outside of the tribe, well, when they do that, the part that they inherited of our collective tribal territory would technically be transferred under the authority of their new husband's house, meaning under that new tribe. So part of the land of Menashe could end up in the hands of Judah or Benjamin or someone else. That is the underlying problem here, is that if we assume, and they've made a pretty good case already, that God wants the land to be divided by each tribe, then if you remove some of that land because the women have inherited it and now are marrying outside of the tribe, then you are diminishing what God wanted to give to each of the tribes. So we seem to be stuck. The women have inherited, we've already established that, but if they move out of their tribe, then we're going to diminish what the tribe has, which has also been established as we want the tribe to have this. Okay, so let's do verse 4. And when there is a home bringing for the children of Israel, and their inheritance is added to the inheritance of the tribe for which they are wives, from the inheritance of our fathers' tribes, their inheritance will be diminished. But eventually, this is going to become a permanent part of their husband's tribe. That this is not just going to be a temporary situation; it is going to pass irrevocably beyond the control of our tribe. And that doesn't seem to be the right answer. Verse 5. So Moshe commanded the children of Israel by order of Adonai, saying, rightfully has the tribe of the sons of Joseph spoken. Now, this is echoing the same way that God confirmed the words of the daughters of Zelophehad, and now we are getting confirmation of the other leaders of the tribe of Manasseh, that indeed both are raising valid points. It is one of the most gratifying things to see in Torah study when Moses or Moses through or God through Moses is saying, you've made a very good point. I'm glad that you have mentioned that because you are taking my law and the implications seriously. And let me explain, now that you're ready to hear it, exactly what needs to be done in this circumstance. So here comes the solution. This is the word that Adonai commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad, saying, right? This is the word, Zehadavar. For those good in their eyes, they may become wives. However, only for a clan from the tribe of their father may they become wives. Now, what does that mean? Well, it seems to be saying two things at the same time. And we're going to look at this in much more detail, but let's get the basic structure. One is that the daughters of Zelophehad can choose their own husbands, that they are not obligated to marry whomever their uncle or their grandfather or some other male member of the family tells them to marry. Their father is dead, so there is no paternal direction here. They are allowed to choose their own husbands. However, it seems to be a limitation that when they choose their own husband, that husband actually does have to come from a smaller pool of candidates, that it can only come from within that tribal affiliation. So they are allowed to choose, but they are only allowed to choose from their own tribe. And that way, the inheritance that they have gained from the passing of their father will not pass beyond the borders of their tribe, that it will still stay in the tribe. So they are being given some freedom, and they are being given some limitations in order to maintain this issue. Now, let's just deal with this on the surface, and we're going to look at this in a lot more depth and detail. So, prepare for the surface reading to be undone, subverted, reconstructed, and all of the stuff that we normally do. But on the surface, what this seems to be saying is that the daughters of Zelophehad had a good point, and the children of the rest of the tribe have a good point, and we are going to find a compromise. We are going to find something that will work for the girls, and we're going to find something that will work for the tribe as a whole. That the needs of those individuals and the needs of the tribal community need to be balanced against each other. That we can't just let them do whatever they want, because that would indeed diminish the entire tribal community. But we also can't tell them, you must do X, Y, and Z precisely, because that would be taking away the legitimate right they have, one, to inherit, and two, to choose for themselves who they wish to marry. So we see at least in the surface reading here, a type of compromise that is protecting both values and both concerns, so that everybody gets something of what they might want, but maybe not everybody is 100% happy. I'm sure that many of the tribal leaders would have been happier to just say women can't inherit and we're taking it all and they can just marry us if they want it. And I'm sure that the daughters of Zelophehad would have liked to have had complete freedom to pick forever whoever they wanted to marry, and that wouldn't be a concern. But each one of them seems to be given some limitations that they probably wouldn't have wanted. So we continue in verse 7 here. Oh, come on, there we go. The inheritance of the children of Israel is not to go round from tribe to tribe, right? It's not It is not supposed to be just passed as parcels from Judah to Benjamin to Joseph to Dan. This is not the tribal amount is supposed to stay with the tribe. Indeed, each one to the inheritance of his father's tribe is to cleave among the children of Israel. Cleave meaning cling to, hold on to. These tribal allocations were meant to be important and they were meant to be long term. And that is what's being corrected, what's being adjusted here from the original statement of the daughters can inherit. It's the daughters can inherit, but, and that but is what is limiting that because of this value, which is incredibly important, that the tribes get to keep what the tribes got. So, and every daughter who comes into possession of inheritance from the tribes of the children of Israel, for someone from the clan of her father's tribe, she must become a wife, in order that the children of Israel may remain in possession, each one, of the inheritance of his fathers. So that's our final discussion, our final statement. There shall not go round the inheritance of a tribe to another tribe. Indeed, each of his inheritance is to cleave among the tribes of the children of Israel, as Adonai had commanded Moshe, thus the daughters of Zelophehad did. So this worked out, right? So they became Machla, Tirza, Hagla, Umilka. And Noah, these are the daughters of Zelophehad. They became wives for the sons of their uncles. And we can talk about marrying cousins another time. That was and remains common in many cultures. It's not so common anymore among ours. But that was not a prohibited level of consanguinity, of proximity of marriage partner. But that's a whole nother can of worms. But that way they did stay within the tribe. So these were in the clans of the sons of Menashe, sons of Joseph. They became wives, so that their inheritance went along with the tribe of the clan of their father. So that is our final answer to all of this. Or is it? Well, that's what we're going to uncover and wrestle a little bit with, because it turns out this is not the final state. And this is something that I want to just get it preloaded in your mind to be considering as we go into our discussion of the text, which is that oftentimes we will read a passage in the Torah and we will think, okay, that's pretty clear. I think I understand what the Torah is saying needs to be done. A woman can inherit if her father dies without any sons, and if she does, she has to marry somebody in her tribe. That seems pretty clear. But we're going to find out that rabbinic literature can take what looks clear and make it a little more confusing. And in doing so, reveal an awful lot about the process, the way that Judaism approaches life and approaches the application of mitzvot. So it's not only about taking what's complicated and making it clear, it's also what's taking what we thought was clear and making it a little bit more complicated because, well, such is life. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into our text. And that means we click there and see exactly what is going on. Now, it's going to take a little while before we get this untangled, but, well, we'll see. Let's let the text speak for itself. So we're on Ta'anit. This is in the Talmud, and it is concerning, well, as you'll see, an odd pairing of holidays. The Mishnah taught that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, there were no days as happy for the Jewish people as Tu B'Av. That's the 15th day of the month of Av. Now we are in the month of Av starting this coming Shabbat. This is beginning our final countdown towards Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th day of Av, when we commemorate the disasters that have befallen our people. But Tu B'Av, well, it's 6 days later, and apparently Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur are considered the happiest days in the calendar. Now, if you don't know what Tu B'Av is, good, we're going to find out. Yom Kippur you probably know, and you might be thinking a little strange to call Yom Kippur a happy day. Well, we're going to explain that one first. The Gemara asks, or rather, explain it as being obvious, granted, Yom Kippur is a day of joy because it has the elements of pardon and forgiveness. And moreover, it is the day on which the last pair of tablets were given. According to the count of when Moses received the first tablets and when he shattered and when he went up and back and up, when we finally get the replacement tablets of the covenant, the timeline works out that that would have happened on Yom Kippur, that God was fully reconciled despite our transgression with the golden calf. And that, of course, marks Yom Kippur very specially historically, as well as just part of the calendar cycle. So Yom Kippur is meant to be a day when we feel joy because we feel that sense of forgiveness. We feel that our sins have been pardoned. We feel renewed on Yom Kippur, and that is an amazing feeling. And I will confirm that personally, that feeling at the end of Yom Kippur is an absolutely incredible high. You don't feel exhausted if you've been doing the spiritual work you were supposed to. Instead, you feel elated because indeed, everything that you have done wrong, if you have properly reconciled and dealt with it, is now in the past. And you can head into the new year a better person and without that baggage. That's an incredible feeling. Okay, so that our ancestors had no problem understanding. However, what is the special joy on the 15th of Av? What makes Tu B'Av so joyous? Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, this was the day on which the members of different tribes were permitted to enter one another's tribe by intermarriage. That is to say, and this is from the commentary, it was initially prohibited to intermarry between tribes, so as to keep each plot of land within the portion of the tribe that originally inherited it. This halacha was instituted by the Torah in the wake of a complaint by the relatives of the daughters of Zelophehad, who were worried that if these women married men from other tribes, the inheritance of Zelophehad would be lost from his tribe. So that's what we were just talking about. But this seems to be saying, it is, that at some point, that rule that you had to marry somebody from your tribe went away. And when that rule went away, which was on the 15th of Av in some year, we'll talk about when, but for the moment, just that's the day of the calendar when it happened, everybody was ecstatic. People were overjoyed that they were no longer limited to getting married to people from within their own tribes. Now, you might be thinking, well, but wait a minute. Wouldn't this have only been involving, some women? Well, yes, but for those women, it also involved the men from the tribe. Because after all, if the women were obligated to marry men within the tribe, then the men were obligated to marry the women who needed to marry the men that were within the tribe. So it was a mutual type of obligation, certainly heavier on the individual women who were in need of marrying within their tribe, but not insignificant for the men that were going to have to be their partners as well. And apparently, this emphasis on marrying within the tribe was quite resented by many, many people around the nation, because once this limitation was lifted, then we no longer we rejoiced, and people no longer had that limitation. People were ecstatic, and in fact turned the 15th of Av into a perpetual holiday. Now, there are other explanations for the 15th of Av, which we're not going to go into because that's not our main focus here. But this seems to be a very powerful statement that the halacha changed, that the Torah said you must marry within your tribe, and then at some point they didn't have to marry within the tribe. And that should be making you scratch your head, if not shaking your fist at your screen, of how dare the rabbis undo what the Torah said. Well, hold on, and recognize, one, by the joy of our people, that this seems to have been the right move, but two, recognize as well that the rabbis would not have simply abrogated something from the Torah without believing that what they were doing was sanctioned by the Torah. So wait for that sanction in our continuing discussion. But let's finish off this section of Talmud first. Oh, come on. So what did they expound? Meaning, in support of their conclusion that this halacha was no longer in effect, how did they prove that indeed it wasn't required that women marry from within their tribe? Well, the verse states, this is the matter, zeh hadavar, that the Lord has commanded concerning the daughters of Zelophehad, saying, let them marry whom they think best, only into the family of the tribe of their father shall they marry. So our text back from Numbers 36 is spelled out that way, and they, the sages, derive from the verse that this matter shall be practiced only in this generation. That is to say, zeh hadavar, this matter, became a limitation phrase that for this generation, this is the matter. This is how we will handle it. But afterwards, members of different tribes were permitted to marry. On the day this barrier separating the tribes was removed, the sages established a permanent day of rejoicing. So the idea is, because of the way the text is written, the rabbis believe that zeh hadavar was pointing only to zehador, this generation, as being the ones bound by the limitation on you must marry within your tribe. After the tribal allocation had taken place, and after that generation moved on, then people were able to marry whomever they wished from whichever tribe they wished, and everybody was so happy that they finally could that it became a day of permanent rejoicing. All right. Now, you might be thinking, that doesn't exactly sound ironclad. And, well, you're probably in good company with that. That there are many times when people will think that the way that the rabbis have explained something doesn't feel powerful enough to them. And we're going to get a more modern interpretation here. This is from the book Jewish Women in Time and Torah, where the author also recognizes that perhaps this doesn't feel like the most compelling explanation for why the rabbis would undo what the Torah had said. That is to say, interpret the Torah as saying, it's not as clear as you think, but in fact, this was a limited mitzvah. It was not a permanent one. But the author wants to explain why the rabbis might have done that. So let's go ahead and check that perspective. Clearly, the laws of inheritance could not be maintained in their original form. So the author is bringing up this idea that there is a fundamental reality check on what the Torah was describing. Originally, the biblical rules were promulgated in response to the complaint of the daughters of Zelophehad. They were told that their complaint was justified, but were commanded to marry men of their own tribe, so that the estates given to the tribes may not be transferred from one tribe to another. As for the children of Israel, everyone should hold on to the estate of his father, as we saw in our text. This ruling, meaning at the time in the Torah, was based on social and economic considerations. That when God was allocating the land and working out the mitzvot that were needed at that time, it wasn't some idealistic, pure E equals MC square kind of law that was permanent throughout the galaxy for all times, although we're not even sure if that one is. But it was instead limited to that particular moment. And it was based upon social and economic considerations, not upon the pure holiness of the issues. So it was based at that time on those considerations, and nevertheless, then, it had to be changed according to the Talmud after the generation of Zelophehad's daughters. The rabbis based their rule on a midrashic interpretation of the two words with which the biblical command is introduced, v'zeh hadavar, this is the matter. This phrase was taken to mean this is the matter only for the present generation, meaning that the tribes were permitted to intermarry in subsequent generations, like we just read about in Ta'anit. The day on which this new ruling was established was the 15th month of Av, on which Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said there were no holidays in Israel that were celebrated, like the 15th day of Av and the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Unquestionably, such a reinterpretation of the words zeh hadavar is extremely weak. Now, as always, anytime someone says unquestionably or undoubtedly or nobody would argue with, chances are people do argue. And personally, I don't think that it is quite so spurious. The rabbis are often using the fine-grained examination of the Torah's text to extract every last piece of information. I don't see why V'zeh Hadavar is any less strong an explanation than many of the others they come to. But for the moment, let's assume that it is. Well, with that in mind, that this is not a powerful statement, it's certainly not self-evident, then we assume that the rule arose from the experience of the people. In actual practice, it became impossible to maintain the marital separation between the 12 tribes. Gradually, all the other laws of inheritance were adjusted, either to practical requirements or in keeping with the restored female dignity in the society. So what the author was saying is that we see numerous places where the rabbis will enact, adjust, or interpret the legislation in a way that reflects the needs of the changing economic world and the needs of the women. We need to look no further than the establishment of the ketubah. The ketubah, which is signed at the time of a wedding, nowadays may be considered more of a formality, still an essential one, but in the time when it was being implemented, it was a creation of the rabbis mipnei tikkun olam, for the perfection of the world, the repairing of the world, because they recognized that without the promissory note that the ketubah is, women were at a severe disadvantage when they entered into a marriage, because having left their family's home, they were now at the whim of their husband in a way that made them extremely vulnerable. And the ketubah was there to ensure that if they were divorced or if their husband died, that they would be taken care of with financial compensation. That isn't stated in the Torah, but the rabbis recognized the need. So too here, there was a recognition that continuing to perpetuate this idea that all the tribes had to stay in their perfect allocations, and that the women were going to be bound by this as well as the men, it just became untenable. And when it became untenable, it had to be clarified that that was only applicable during a particular part of our history. Now, with that in mind, we then read Rabbeinu Bachya, who is a later medieval commentator, who has a more mystical bent, to see that maybe that's not the only way to look at this. But of course, that's going to make the rabbi's decision. Well, you'll see how he tries to handle it. So that the ancestral property will not make the rounds from tribe to another tribe, like we talked about in our quote. This commandment was valid only for the generation of the Israelites entering the land of Canaan at the time, which we saw in Ta'anit, and we're going to see in Bava Batra in just a minute. At the time, the 12 tribes of the Israelites on terrestrial Earth corresponded to their exact counterparts in the celestial spheres. This is taken from the Zohar, but understand that there have been and continue to be people who look at the 12 tribes as recognized as corresponding to the 12 astrological symbols. Now, the role of astrology in Judaism is complicated and a whole nother conversation, but understand that looking at the astronomical symbols was a way of keeping track of the calendar year, that the astrology was part of the calendar that was writ large across the sky, which God explained in the book of Genesis, that's what those lights up there are going to do for us. And that the idea here is that there was a heavenly level as well, a heavenly division that corresponded to those astrological symbols, and that the 12 tribes were indeed matched to each one of those, one tribe to one symbol. Therefore, if one tribe would have sold part of its ancestral territory to another here on Earth, the result would have been an imbalance of the forces representing the tribes in the celestial regions. So this is part and parcel of how mysticism works, especially Jewish mysticism, with the idea that our actions here have a corresponding action somehow in the celestial realm. And the idea here is that there needed to be a non-transfer of the land in order to maintain the balance above. However, Rabbeinu Bachya is going to answer our question of if that was so important, because this wasn't just a matter of the economic justice, but was in fact based upon the heavenly realm, then how did we ever change it? Well, once the people had settled in Eretz Israel, which is the terrestrial counterpart of the sum total of all of these celestial forces of the tribes, this did not matter anymore. So the basic resolution here is, well, yes, when they were just settling, they were each individual, but once the settling was done, then we were Klal Yisrael, we were all Israel together. As such, moving around the people inside of the different areas no longer was important because we all were now one totality. Now, is that a weak argument for why they would have gotten rid of it? Well, it depends on how much you believe the mystical interpretation of what's happening on ground represents what's happening up in the spheres. Um, but understand as well that even someone like Rabbeinu Bachya and indeed the Zohar itself, even those passionate Kabbalists who often are willing to overlook the needs of this world, recognize that indeed we did change the way the Torah seemed to be allocating the land and requiring women to marry within their tribe. And they may have a different explanation because of the unity of the tribes, which again doesn't exactly seem ironclad, but to them it was still necessary because they weren't going to say, we need to marry within the tribes anymore. They had to recognize that, no, we weren't doing this anymore. And so they came up with a good explanation for why it wasn't necessary to do it anymore, rather than trying to go backwards. That is a very important Jewish concept, and one that unfortunately has not always been adhered to in the modern time, which is to say that the chain of our tradition has a one-directional arrow, that when we adjust things, when we interpret things, when we apply Torah, and when we adapt them to our circumstances within the bounds of halachic process, that we don't go backwards unless the situation was identical, which is impossible, because even if we thought the situation was the same as it was 1,000 years ago, it's still later than it was 1,000 years ago, and a lot has happened in the middle. So this is not saying, let's go back because we want to bring the heavenly spheres into alignment. This is saying, Earth is in a different place. The heavenly spheres are going to have to adjust. And we're going to come up with an explanation for why that is. Now, to say all of that more clearly, I hope, we're going to look at the Talmud, at the section from Bava Batra that he was quoting there. Now, this is a little bit longer than some of the sections of the Talmud we've dealt with, but we're going to go through it, remembering again where it's bold, that is the actual words of the Talmud, and where it is not bold, those are the words of the commentary, to try and help us understand the whole Talmud in a more easy to manage text. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, the daughters of Zelophehad were permitted to marry members of any of the tribes. As it is stated, let them be married to whom they think best. But how do I realize the meaning of the continuation of the same verse? Only into the family of the tribe of their fathers shall they be married, according to which they were permitted to marry only members of their own tribe. All right, so Shmuel's opinion is the daughters could marry whoever they wanted. The Talmud then says, wait a minute, Shmuel. The second half of the verse says they have to be married within their tribes. How are you reconciling that? You can't just read the first half of the verse, let them be married to who they want, and not read the second half of the verse, which says only in the tribes. So, how do we reconcile that? Shmuel explains, the verse offered them good advice, that they should be married only to those fit for them, who were often men from within their family. All right, so Shmuel is saying that second half of the verse that says only, well, that's just a recommendation. That isn't a commandment. In fact, the only commandment that we have in this verse is they get to pick who they want. No one can force them. The second half of the verse, where it says only into the family, that's just telling them they should look there first. That oftentimes other members of your family, extended, are going to be the most appropriate partners for marriage. You share a lot and all of that kind of thing. And therefore, it was just an opinion. Okay. Rabbah raised an objection. Now, Rabbah and Shmuel often argue, so this is no surprise. So Rabbah raised an objection. He's not happy with Shmuel's reading of our verse. And he raises an objection from a Braita. Remember, a Braita is a piece of earlier rabbinic text that was from around the time of the Mishnah, but it's not contained verbatim in the Mishnah. So it is another piece of our text, but not within the official canon, if you will. But the Talmud often has access to these extra texts, and they are very useful for clarifying things. So he raised an objection from a Braita taught concerning the prohibition against eating consecrated foods while in a state of ritual impurity. Now, don't get lost. This is the normal way of the Talmud, that if you want to understand one situation, you have to find a parallel situation where things are clearer, and then use that clarity to understand what the first, more confusing situation is actually about. It's very normal for us to do this in our normal day-to-day life, and the rabbis do this with exceptional skill. They have an encyclopedic knowledge of the rest of Judaism, so they can bring it to bear at any time to help clarify any piece that seems especially unclear at that moment. So, what is they going to say? Well, Moses was commanded, say to them, whoever will be of all your descendants throughout your generations, who approaches the holy things, which the children of Israel consecrate to the Lord, having his uncleanness upon him, that soul shall be cut off before me. All right, you can't be ritually impure when you are coming into the sacred, into contact with the things that are sanctified. Which people are referred to in the phrase, say to them, right? Who's the them that are being addressed here? It is referring to those standing at Mount Sinai. That's where this happened. That was the them. Which people are referred to in the phrase throughout your generations? These are the coming generations. All right, so understand what he's saying is that because there seems to be a redundancy here, we have to interpret the two different pieces. Say to them, the generation that's currently here at Mount Sinai, that this will involve your generations, meaning the people who come after you. So it was said with regards to both audiences, current and future. If the halacha is stated to the fathers, why is it stated to the sons? And if the halacha is stated to the sons, why is it stated to the fathers? All right, very reasonable question now that we've got that first part down, which is, but that's redundant. Just say you cannot you cannot come near if you are ritually impure, and we'll know that it's permanent. Or say for all your generations, don't come near if you're impure. We don't need to include say it to them. It seems to be redundant. And that means that we have to come up with an explanation for why there is a redundancy. This is because there are mitzvot for the fathers that are not for the sons. And there are mitzvot for the sons that are not for the fathers. That means that there are some mitzvot that applied to one generation but not the next, and some mitzvot that didn't apply to a generation but would become applicable to future generations. Now, don't worry about that. We're going to explain it. The Braita continues. For the fathers, the verse states, and every daughter who possesses an inheritance in the tribe of children of Israel shall be a wife to one of the family of the tribe of her father. That is to say, our quote from our original text reading is an example of a mitzvah that applied to one generation, but not forever. This mitzvah, that the woman should marry a member of her own tribe, applied only to the first generation that received tribal portions of Eretz Israel. And by contrast, there were many mitzvot, that is to say, all the mitzvot that applied only from the time of Eretz Israel, that Eretz Israel was settled, which the sons were commanded to fulfill, but which the fathers were not commanded to fulfill. So numerous agricultural laws, numerous laws regarding certain poverty rules, many aspects of the mitzvot only applied once we crossed the Jordan and settled into the land. So Clearly, if you were at Sinai 40 years before all that took place, those mitzvahs didn't apply to you, but they would apply to the later generations. So some mitzvot applied and then were abrogated, and some mitzvot were not implemented until later generations came along. That seems to be pretty clear, but it is important to our discussion today that the example of it used to be, but then it wasn't, is the example of women being forced to marry within their own tribe. But let's continue because this is not done yet. Because there are mitzvot for the fathers that were not for the sons, and there are mitzvot for the sons that were not for the fathers, meaning different generational mitzvot, the verse needed to state, that is to say, address the fathers, and it needed to state, that is to say, address the sons. So say to them, every generation, you needed both parts there in order for us to know that this mitzvah really was for everyone for all time. That is to say, the mitzvah about purity. But for our case today, talking about the inheritance issue, we can see that that is being used as an example of a mitzvah that eventually expired. So let's carry on with that particular point, because that was where we started with Shmuel's opinion that it only applied, it didn't apply to the daughters of Zelophehad. They could marry anyone, and they got advice about who they could marry or who they should marry, but it wasn't binding. And that seemed to be at odds with this idea that every girl needed to marry within the tribe at the time of settling the land of Israel. Okay, how are we going to deal with this? Rabbah states his objection. In any event, the Braita teaches, for the fathers, the verse states, and every daughter who possesses an inheritance from the tribe of the children of Israel shall be a wife for one of the family. This indicates that this was a mitzvah for that entire generation, including Zelophehad's daughters, in contrast to the statement of Shmuel, who seemed to think that they had free pick, but were just given advice. The Gemara explains. So we are now reconciling Rabbah and Shmuel's opinions in order to try and come to a compromised, harmonious explanation. In all places where possible, we like to be able to honor the different teachings and to find a way to incorporate elements of both in a more holistic rendition of what we should take away. So here is that unified version. He, Rabbah, raised the objection and he resolved it, meaning, you know what, Rabbah? I know you think you were shooting down Shmuel, but in fact, by the way you raised your objection, you actually came to the same conclusion as Shmuel, but you also clarified Shmuel in a very important way. So what does it mean? The mitzvah applied to everyone except for the daughters of Zelophehad, who were explicitly permitted to marry members of any tribe. So let's go back to the section on Torah and read it now with the eyes of what we are looking at here with what the Talmud has just told us. So coming back here to verse 6, we have our zehadavar, right? This is the matter, this is the thing, this is the word. And that's being used as our explanation that this was time-bound. Now, everybody seems to be agreed on that. Nobody is arguing we need to go back to all women who are inheriting have to marry within the tribe. That's gone. Nobody is of that opinion. Instead, they're just arguing about what were the actual conditions during the generation of the daughters of Zelophehad during that time period when this was applicable. And what we see now in our final resolution in the Talmud is that when it says that God commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad, for them and only them, they get to choose whoever they want. Whoever is good in their eyes, they are allowed to marry them. It would be nice if they married within their families, but the first line is the most important. However, that is only for the daughters of Zelophehad, because later on, we see that every daughter who comes into possession, yada yada, has to marry within her tribe. For everyone else, they don't get that dispensation. But all of this, the daughters of Zelophehad having their own choice, all the other women who inherit during the time of the settlement of the land of Israel not having a choice and having to marry within their tribe, all of that is still only limited to the generation of the settlement of the land of Israel during the allocation of the land of Israel. Once that time period is done, then happy days, 15th of Av, Tu B'Av, it is time to allow the tribes to do whatever they want. And if you want to marry somebody from a different tribe, God bless you. You are no longer causing any trouble because the allocations had taken place. Now, all of this is an incredibly powerful statement of the need to constantly be reviewing what the Torah has taught us and how we actually apply different mitzvot at different times. Some mitzvot do have an expiration date, this one being one of the most prominent examples. Other mitzvot, we had to wait until they kicked in, like the different mitzvot about the land of Israel. When someone tries to make a claim that the halacha never changes, from Sinai till now, Torah has always been the same, they are exposing themselves as being either ignorant or deliberately deceptive of what our tradition actually teaches. The Talmud is not some modern liberal idea about, oh, do what you feel like, and that is not what I'm preaching either, but instead recognizing that we are commanded to read and study and understand how the Torah must be done and applied and used and interpreted in every single generation. We do not set things aside, we do not add things to it, but we are constantly looking at how the Torah is speaking to us at any given time. It is not an easy process, and it's definitely not one we do on our own. We don't just get to pick and choose what we think the Torah wants me to do today, but not tomorrow, and vice versa. But together, we can navigate this. We not only have the permission to do so, we have the obligation to do so. Because if we were to simply say, nope, I'm going with what the Torah said and I'm never changing it because the way I read it is the way it's right, then we would be violating what God wanted us to do. God wanted the generations after the settlement of the land of Israel to be able to marry in other tribes. If we didn't allow it because we were somehow being more traditional, then we would be the ones who were violating the mitzvah, because we would now be creating an obligation that breached our responsibility to God to actually apply the Torah as we received it. It's not as easy as to say people who change are the ones that are lenient. Sometimes the people who don't change are the ones who are being lenient, who are preserving something that God has told us not to preserve, that are forcing something that God has told us not to do. And well, that's not good. So hopefully we all take firm hold of the inheritance that we've been given, which is the Torah, which is better than any piece of land, even the land of Israel. We've lived longer with the Torah than we have with Israel in our possession. But hopefully we can keep having both, which is the blessing of the modern time. But remember, hold on to that inheritance, understand it, learn it, use it. And with that, I'll bid you all a good day and take care. Bye.